Oh, you're back. Oh, welcome back to Intermediate Writing, or Intermediate Composition. Professor Kentley again. All right, we are going to continue talking about introductions, and I'm just going to, talk through the little guide in my book here about introductions and point out some things. Because some of these examples are not the best examples, I should probably rework this. My book is a work in progress. It's been in development for a few years. But we talked last time about background, specific background, and often that's a key part of a good introduction. Not always. You can just maybe get right to stating the problem, stating the specific problem and then presenting your thesis. This is the solution I'm going to present. But oftentimes you develop a specific background information that leads to your thesis, or that leads to a statement of the problem and then a thesis. Often after your thesis, it's better, especially with a more complicated topic, to present sort of a plan or overview. So your thesis is your main idea, your main objective for the whole essay. And in the same sentence or in the next sentence, you might present an overview or a plan of how you're going to develop the thesis. So for example, the example I have here, this is on section 3.8 in my book. American English alone should not be used as the basis for world English. Main argument, thesis. Next, because, the overview or plan. 1. Such a policy would limit global English to one dialect. 2. Would breed possible resentment toward English. 3. And would hinder linguistic innovation. So, without using the words 1, 2, and 3 in the paragraph, I have laid out how I'm going to develop the thesis. The first section, maybe the first paragraph or several paragraphs of the body, will develop the first line of argument about how such a policy or practice limits global English to one dialect. Next section of the body will develop the next argumentation, the next line of argument. This breeds resentment toward English or towards specific countries like the US. 3. The next section will talk about how this hinders linguistic innovation. And that's how you kind of develop your thesis with kind of a plan, and each part of the plan is going to correspond to maybe a topic sentence in a body paragraph or to a whole section, maybe several paragraphs in a longer essay or paper. Now, there are different specific introduction styles to college writing I've got in the next section. Now, some of these are more academic and some are maybe a bit less so, maybe more so for a first-year essay in an introductory college class or first-year class. The first one, like I said, provides specific background information on the topic. This example is a literary analysis essay. Looking at a famous story in American literature. It's a famous short story in American literature called Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, this intro begins by basically summarizing the story. Now, whether you would do this really depends on how familiar the story is to your reader. If most readers, if it's a very familiar story, Romeo and Juliet, we all know what happens in Romeo and Juliet. You don't need to provide us a general summary of that storyline. In this case, it depends. With the kind of hypothetical audience you're writing for, like your classmates and your professor already know about the basic story of, Young Goodman Brown. In that case, maybe just a one-sentence summary would do that focuses more on, like the key point that you're going to talk about. Like the depiction in Young Goodman Brown of a man's faith being tested shows that, thesis, Hawthorne is communicating to the reader about how, we should resist temptation, but on a deeper level is conveying skepticism about Puritan religion. If the story is familiar to your reader, with information is familiar to your reader, don't repeat it or summarize it very, very, very concisely. So whether example 1 is an effective intro is going to depend on the context. This would maybe be more appropriate to maybe a first-year literature course, college literature course in American literature. But probably not for an advanced course in literature or American literature, because then it would be really familiar, and this would be need to be more concise and more informative. Or instead of recounting the general details, recount the really specific details, like the ending of the story. The ending of the story, and recount maybe in a bit more detail exactly how the story ends, and then tie that into a thesis that this conveys skepticism about Puritan religion. Number 2, a brief example. This is not the best example because there's no specific background going. When you read this, you may be going, what? So let me kind of fill in the background. I had in mind when I wrote this, a little different theories about the origin of Indo-European. So Indo-European is this big language family, includes many of the European languages like English and Spanish and Latin and Greek and Russian and so on, which all go back to some ancient ancestor language in some ancient tribal homeland somewhere, probably about 5,000 years ago. So it would be better if the paragraph started with that. So it would, for example, for decades, linguists have debated the original homeland of the Indo-European language family, with the leading theories focusing on either, this region and that region. There are two main regions here, Ukraine and what's now Turkey. Then, an analysis of the competing theories of the original tribal homelands of the Proto-Indo-Europeans will help linguists and archaeologists in determining the origin and development of their languages. Now, that would work better. If you have enough background to make sense of this, then number 2 would work. Okay, number 3, specific example. Now, number 3, something like this would work if it is a specific, not like your own personal anecdote, your own personal story. This is what happened to me. This is what happened to my best friend or my brother. But if it's a documented example by a professional writer or an academic writer, professional writer in this case, this is by a person who is a professor who started an NGO, a non-governmental organization that fights human trafficking. So if it's a documented example, and I could cite the source, a source by a credible author or authors, in this case this professor in California who got involved in the issue of human trafficking because of this incident, then this would be good. And I would probably want to cite the source somehow or mention the source. The professor, whose name is David Batstone, and his book, Not for Sale, by the way, great read. So in that case, if it's a documented example and it's specific, then this would work as an intro, at least in a college paper or in a professional context, maybe not so much in a PhD level work or a really academic research paper that's published in an academic journal, but this would be good for college writing and such, or business type writing. Number 4, if this were a whole paragraph, this would work. Specific background information. So if this began with some specific background information about the current controversy, whatever current controversy the writer is talking about, then the example in 4 would be a good thesis for an intro paragraph. The current controversy over this company's products is merely the latest example. Okay, if he gave some background information on number 4, then the sentence here, number 4, would be a good thesis. So number 4 needs to be developed, but as a thesis, it's a good example. Number 5, we kind of talked about some examples in the last lecture video about kind of countering common assumptions. So sometimes in developing the background or stating the problem, you might kind of also counter or go against common assumptions that the reader has. Or in this case, getting the reader to look at something in a new way. So maybe several of these examples that I'm talking about could be kind of grouped under this. Countering common assumptions, or getting people to look at something in a new way. So American consumers bemoan, let's kind of complain about. It's a bit colloquial, so maybe complain about taxes, gasoline taxes. But look at it this way, in other countries that have higher taxes, they have better roads, better infrastructure, and such. And so this, if this is maybe developed a bit more, this could be a good introduction. For example, Canada. So I remember my wife and I were on a road trip, and we went from New York to Canada. Suddenly, Canada, the roads are so much better than in the U.S. These are good roads. And when I was in Europe, these roads are pretty good. I wish we had good roads like this in the U.S. It kind of depends on where in the U.S. you are, of course, I guess. But in a lot of places, the roads aren't as well maintained because they want their low taxes. All right. So that's an area where you need to correct common assumptions. Yeah, high taxes maybe on your gasoline. Yeah, it's not convenient. But hey, better roads. And hey, if you have better roads, it's less damage to your car, so you don't have to spend so much money repairing your car. Yeah, that's something you could do with this paragraph. And so if your concern is about what about poor people, well, hey, maybe poor people won't have to spend so much money fixing their cars if the roads are better. 6, getting from somewhat specific to more specific, fairly specific. So talking about general household inflation, household spending on food, and then you go to even more specific, like Canadian maritime provinces, those provinces on the coast of Canada, especially the East Coast. So going from less specific to more specific kind of develops your attention as the reader to something more specific. Number 7, quotations. Be careful with quotations. It is sometimes okay to use quotations if it really works. A common quotation like, oh, to be is not to be, it's probably not going to work. Again, especially in English-speaking culture, we have this kind of assumption as readers of essays, college essays, academic research papers, or even more professional writing in business context. I want to be informed. Even if it's, your opinion, I want to be informed. I want intelligent discussion of your perspective. Even so, whether it's the information or if it's your perspective, I want an intelligent discussion of, someone else's perspective. And so that's my assumption as a reader. So if it's a common quotation, that's going to be boring. Okay, boring. I like, it's going to tell me, okay, this doesn't sound like a very creative or informative essay. Maybe not a very persuasive essay. I want something interesting. So if you start with Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, and by the way, if you haven't read Kierkegaard, he's good to read, especially if you want to kind of like blow your mind, going, what did I read? But in a good way that makes you think. Read Kierkegaard. He's a cool philosopher, one of my favorite philosophers. Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, in describing the soul confronting its existential condition, noted that, and any quote from Kierkegaard is going to be deep. I can trust you. Any quote from a good philosopher like Kierkegaard is going to be deep. It's going to make you think. And maybe I should find an actual quote and put it in here as an example. So, a good quote, if it's a specific topic like Kierkegaard's philosophy about the self, his philosophy about ethics and morals, any quote by him is going to be thought-provoking, interesting, and it's going to be a good lead into an essay on a specific topic like philosophy of yourself, philosophy of existence, philosophy of meaning in life, philosophy of some kind of moral or ethical issue, and such. So a good, intelligent quote can work, but don't just throw in a quote for the sake of throwing in a quote, for decoration, for sort of bling, for decoration, or showing off. Don't do that. Only if it actually meaningfully sets up your thesis, your main point, your objective. If the quote sets up your thesis, if it leads into your thesis, a good main idea, your objective, then yes, use a good quote, an intelligent quote. If it's just there for decoration, cut it out. Because your professor, when he's reading that, is going to go, this is just for decoration. Okay, it's like a star on a Christmas tree. It doesn't, a single star doesn't do much. It's just there to look pretty. Just decoration. Doesn't really have any real function there for presenting an intelligent main idea. Be careful with quotes. And it's maybe a little more common in humanities writing. If you're writing like an essay in a literature class, sure. If you're writing an essay and you're critiquing Shakespeare, okay, then a Shakespeare quote will be good. If it's not something like to be or not to be, but something more interesting, an interesting Shakespeare quote, my favorite quote from Shakespeare. My favorite Shakespeare play is King Lear. It's a really cool play, and there's this really deep, profound thought. It seems dark, but it's really cool. So something like this, if you're writing about Shakespeare's view of life and death as seen in the play King Lear, then a quote like this would work. We are as flies unto the gods, they kill us for their sport. Cool quote. We are as flies unto the gods, they kill us for their sport. Something like that, I think it goes. Cool quote. Yeah, it sounds dark, but it's a good launching point for a discussion, a philosophical discussion of, say, Shakespeare's views on life and death, or ethics and morality. And the cool thing about King Lear, it's kind of like, it shows what goes around, comes around. Like these bad characters did evil, and the evil came back to them and killed them too, in a really satisfying way. It's really cool. King Lear is really worth reading. Next. 8 definitions. Don't put in a dictionary definition or common definition, but if you need to define a special term, like whether it's the way the word theory is used in science, which is different from the way it's used in colloquial English, or a very specific technical term here like cognitive linguistics or psycholinguistics, a definition can be a good lead-in to an introductory paragraph. An intelligent definition that is informative, that tells the reader something new and sets up your objective. Like in this case, cognitive linguistics, okay, defining cognitive linguistics. It would then especially work if the rest of this introductory paragraph is then going to lead into a thesis about how cognitive linguistics is a better way to approach a particular problem in linguistics. That would work. An intelligent definition that serves a purpose. Do not throw in a Wikipedia definition or a dictionary definition. And don't cite Wikipedia, please, in an essay, especially an intro. That's really high schoolish. I say that every year, but every year it happens. 9, maybe as part of an intro, interesting facts or statistics that goes along specific background information, if this then leads to an interesting thesis. So number 9 would work if it leads to an interesting thesis, an intelligent thesis. 10, same thing, a contrast, kind of countering somebody's assumptions. I didn't know this. This sounds bad. African Americans can expect to live roughly 9.3 fewer years than white Americans. Wow, that's an attention getter. It's not like a real informal hook, but it is an interesting, striking contrast, countering your assumptions. Didn't know that, just assumed. Okay. And if that then leads into a specific interesting thesis, like you're in an analysis of the problem. 11, in maybe a more informal context, you might establish your qualifications. Gee, I'm a doctor, I went to Harvard Medical School, I know what I'm saying here. But in a more formal academic writing context, you could say more third person kind of way, or not too much first person. After 9 years of teaching, we've come to the conclusion that and such. In certain contexts, this works. Maybe not in the most formal academic context, but some cases in professional writing, business writing, something like 11 would work, establishing your qualifications. As after 20 years in upper level management, we have found that the best way of handling this problem is such and such. 12. Again, countering common assumptions. You might think all this controversy, all these political scandals is a bad thing, but actually, in a way, it's kind of good because it shows that people have higher expectations of morality in government than maybe people did 100 years ago. So in that sense, something like 12 would work if I clarify that. Maybe 100 years ago, this would have been wouldn't have been in the news, but now it is and people care. This actually does show that there's a higher expectation of morality in our government, and this is actually not a bad thing. 13, rhetorical question, be careful. Because overuse of questions and rhetorical questions can sound informal. We saw one or two examples in the last video where it kind of worked. I'm not a big fan of using questions in introductions because overuse of questions does sound informal. It can sound like you're talking to yourself in your intro. And you don't want to sound like you're talking to yourself like you're some crazy old man talking to himself. So be careful with use of questions if it's meaningful and it actually leads to stating a specific, interesting objective in your paragraph. 14 is, again, countering common assumptions. With something that sounds controversial, should we remove the president if he's endangering our public safety or something like that? Because, before 2016, we didn't really talk that much about removing a president from office. Now we kind of have to because of certain things. Okay, so those are some ideas for introduction. Something specific, something that sounds professional, something that's interesting, that tells the reader, I've got something interesting to say, I got some interesting ideas and some interesting information here I'm going to tell you about. That's what the sense that the reader should get from your introduction. Even if it's just like business writing, a business report or something, a business analysis. Okay, some ideas for conclusions. I'm not going to get into conclusions too much. I don't have a lot of examples. Without repeating the introduction, you kind of reword what was the main point of the essay, what were the main things that you showed, what you've argued, and maybe the implications. Why is this important? Why have you talked about this? Why is this important? And again, I should probably add some examples, which maybe I'll do in the next version of this book. But some common problems to avoid in intros and conclusions. Avoid very general statements. This problem deserves serious attention. This is going to fix everything, kind of overly general statements and things like that. Overly vague statements like, oh, we need to do something about this, or this problem needs to be addressed, or society needs to change. Its attitudes towards gender roles needs to change. Okay, say something a little more specific and more interesting in your conclusion. This is important because, or I've argued this, and then maybe the next step. What's the next step? What needs to be done next? What needs to be done in a very specific and interesting way, but that not something that could be the thesis of a whole new essay, though. But voters, maybe you need to actually demand, more accountability from the people that they vote for, or something that's actually not too trivial or too general. Avoid first person when you can. Definitely avoid second person. Avoid non-professional language. Avoid general statements, vague statements in your introductions and in your conclusions. So a conclusion is really just a restatement, usually of the main points that you've talked about. maybe a statement of its implications, why you talked about this, why is it important, and that's basically all you have to do in a conclusion. So I think probably next week in some upcoming assignments, I'm going to have you practice some of this with some assignments, and I'll tell you more later about that. So I'm kind of planning some assignments where I'm going to have you kind of do this, or maybe I'll talk more about how these are done in a specific genre, and have you do it, have you practice it in some assignments, and then also for the midterm, and I'll have more to say about the midterm a little bit later. So, okay, hope you've enjoyed this, hope you've gotten something out of this. Just be careful with your introductions. Make them interesting, make them more interesting, make them specific. Get the reader's interest without using very informal hooks like boom, like that. Be interesting. Give the reader a hint that something interesting is coming. You have something intelligent and interesting to say. The information and your perspective have some value or interest. So get the reader's interest in your introduction with something intelligent, something fairly formal, professional sounding, and specific intro, specific thesis. And that's what you want to do in the intro of an essay, or in some kinds of business writing, which maybe we'll talk a bit about later on. Okay, so that's it for today. I might give you some homework for the weekend. I'm not sure. I'll try. If not, sorry. I'll do my best. But otherwise, enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you back here on Monday. Bye.